Good evening, staff, students and friends at Wolverhampton and members of the WFA, of which I am a sometime member. I'm really delighted to be here, acknowledging the stature of the institution that Gary has created, the War Studies bit of Wolverhampton, and the quality of its staff and students, which are known internationally, studying military history in general and, of course, the Great War in particular. It's known and appreciated in this country, as we can see from the number here, and far beyond Britain, because I know it. Now, I've come more or less to Wolverhampton from a brief holiday in Spain and Gibraltar, and I was intrigued to observe that there's a strange contrast between war and remembrance in Spain and in Britain, and indeed in Australia. I was really astonished that in Spain, I saw almost no mention or reference to the Spanish Civil War, this massively traumatic conflict that tore Spain apart, 80 odd years ago. And yet only in one church did I see a memorial to, in this case, the Catholics of Cordoba, who had been killed in the Spanish Civil War. And the reason for that, I discovered, was that Spain has a law of historical memory, which is a bit ironic because it forbids people from exploring the memory of the Spanish Civil War. It forbids streets to be named, statues to be erected, memorials to be built to those who served and died in this terrible civil war. And what's the contrast with your country and my country? And you know this because last week, everybody in the country had a red poppy on their breast, national, local ceremonies of all kinds. There is no law of historical memory operating in Britain, and there certainly isn't in Australia, as I'll talk about presently. In fact, war remembrance in our two countries is more like a civic religion. It might only be a civic religion like Easter Christians, where people only practice it around the 11th of November here and around the 25th of April, Anzac Day at home, for me. But it's still an important part of our past and the way we think about our past. Now, I'm especially pleased to be able to redeem a promise I made to Gary just over 4 years ago. I was touring southern England, looking at the county archives and regimental museums, mostly of southern England, for reasons I'll explain later, for researching what turned out to be my latest book, which, as Gary mentioned, is Terriers in India, published by Hellion of Southall, of this parish. For the past 15 years or so, I've mostly published only on the Great War, mostly. They're the books that I've done on the Great War since 2005, and I'll talk about some of them tonight. Some of them Gary was kind enough to mention, and some of them do work. Two of them are Hellion books, Terriers and Die in Battle, so products of the West Midlands. So I've done these books on the Great War. So I say some of them work and some of them don't work. The one that's the worst book is that one, Lost Boys of Anzac. Dreadful book. Let me tell you what it was a brilliant idea, and it's a fantastic title, but it's a lousy book. I had the idea, and the title came to me first, and I thought, what book would fit that? Oh, I know. I had the idea to write a book about the men of the very first wave of Australians who landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula on the 25th of April, 1915, who died on the 25th of April, 1915. And there were exactly 101 of them. And I thought, looking at their lives and their deaths and the way their deaths affected their families and the way they were remembered, would make a really interesting study of Australia in the outbreak of the Great War and what the Great War meant for Australia. Well, that was a great pitch, and not one but two publishers bought the pitch. The first publisher went broke, not because of this book, but they just went broke. And the second publisher was so impressed with it that they said, this is a book that deserves 120,000 words. Well, 120,000 words divided into 101 men, and it starts to get stretched very thin. And the fact was that it was a terrible book, because if you're Tolstoy, you can write a book with 101 characters in it, but I can't. But some of them worked. That one on the bottom left over there, The Crying Years, Australia's Great War. It's basically a look at the First World War, the Australian experience of the First World War, told through the collection of the National Library of Australia. Gary mentioned that I worked at the Australian War Memorial for far too many years, and it basically presents a view of Australia's experience of the Great War, which is khaki-coloured and happens in France and Gallipoli. Well, if you look at the National Library's collection, it's about the vast majority of Australians who didn't serve overseas. So it's about the conscription referenda and the internment of German Australians, and shortages and food protests and conscription referenda and all sorts of things. And so I think it's a much more interesting book. And I must say, I had a lot of fun doing it. So the point is that I do have done a lot of work on the Great War, and I'll talk about some of these others along the way. Quinn's Post, which is the top left, which is the First World War book I did, published in 2005. I wrote it because I went to Gallipoli. I waited a long time to go to Gallipoli. I started work at the War Memorial in 1980, and I didn't go to the Gallipoli Peninsula until 2002. So people used to think I knew all about it. You know, oh, you must know it intimately. Well, I did, but only by looking at maps and reading books and things. Anyway, I went there, and I went there planning to write a book about what I thought was the 101 Australians who won the Distinguished Conduct Medal on Gallipoli. And it turned out there weren't 101 of them at all. There were 139. And when I got there, I discovered I couldn't find any of the places. You know, there's no point going there because you couldn't tell one bit of scrub from another. And it was a really stupid idea. But I happened to go to a place that I realized was Quinn's Post, and realized that on the spot that Quinn's Post deserved a biography. So I wrote about Quinn's Post, which was, now for those of you who don't know, Quinn's Post is the bit of the Anzac line which is closest to the Turks. So in fact, if I'm the Australians, Duncan Rogers up there is the Turks. And you can easily throw a Big Mac that far. So it was a place of continual bomb fights. It was the point at which the Turks only had to sprint 30 yards across no man's land to break into the Anzac line and make their way down Monash Valley and Shrapnel Valley to Anzac Cove. And so it was a place which was always in action. It wasn't a place of quiet ever in the whole 8-9 months of the campaign. And writing Quinn's Post meant I had to go to New Zealand to write it, because Quinn's was created by the Australians, and then at the end of May they nearly lost it. The Turks broke into Quinn's, and there was a terrible hand-to-hand fight that the Turks were ejected, and after that the Australians were ejected by Godley, the corps commander. The New Zealanders basically strengthened the post and made it impregnable, and then the Australians were brought back and told to hold it, and they did for the rest of the campaign. Well, that meant that I had to go to New Zealand to read New Zealand diaries and letters and look at photographs and whatnot, and realized, and again, it shouldn't have taken me 25 years to do this, realized that New Zealand had a distinctive experience of the Great War, a distinctive memory of the Great War, even though Australia's appropriated the idea of Anzac. You know, if you say Anzacs, most Australians think that they're Australians. Well, obviously, Anzacs are Australians and New Zealanders, but Australians don't recognise that socially. So that awareness, that embarrassed awareness that New Zealand was different to Australia, made me start thinking about the relations between not just Australia and Britain, but bits of the Empire and Britain, and indeed bits of the Empire and each other. And that's really what I want to talk about for the first half of this talk. And this is a very live issue for me, because as an Australian military historian, I'm a bit embarrassed to talk about Australian military history away from home, because Australian military history tends to be very parochial. If you write British military history, you write the military history of the world, don't you? Because you've either fought in or against or for most of bits of the world. But Australian military history tends to be mostly about Australia, even though most of the Australians haven't fought at home. Not entirely, but mostly. And that's because military history in Australia has always been about the definition and the expression of a very distinctive Australian national identity. Those two things are completely connected. And unfortunately, as time passes, that connection between national identity and military history gets stronger and stronger, not weaker and weaker, but increasingly strong. Indeed, during the recently ended Great War centenary, with a compliant, lazy media, with an active government propaganda campaign, and the willing compliance of assertively nationalistic, we would say ochre, popular writers, that tendency to regard Australia's experience as being worse than anybody else's, with heavier losses than everybody else, with greater volunteering than anybody else, contribution bigger than anybody else's, intensified. I'll talk a bit more about this in a sec. And that's the one reason why, as the Great War centenary ended, I decided that I was going to leave the Great War for a field that where I wasn't always battling against this popular tide. I'm not that I'm saying I'm not interested in the First World War. I really am. But I've moved to an area now, British military history in India, where you have to ginger people up. And in fact, I was saying to Gary, he said, "What's the next book?" It's on the Santal Rebellion of 1855. Hands up if you've heard of the Santal Rebellion of 1855. Yes. Go on, don't be embarrassed. There are some of us who have. It was the biggest rebellion against the British in India in the 19th century, except for 1857, and nobody's heard of it. There's next to nothing on it. So I thought, right, I'm not going to knock my head against these popular assumptions and this popular legend. I'm going to write some original history, so that's what I'm doing. But I'm not talking about that now. Because I want to talk about Australian military history for a while more. If you're remotely sensitive to context and evidence, and you bother to take an interest in the literature of the war as a whole, you can't do Australian military history without becoming aware that if you're Australian, you tend to think that Australia was the only country fighting the war, and it was the only country that suffered, and it suffered more and worse and did better. And if you think about other parts of the British Empire in Australia, and the British Empire, of course, is not a phrase which trips off the tongue in Australia. Australians don't like to think of themselves as having been part of the British Empire. You think of it in adversarial terms. You ignore the New Zealanders, of course, but you think of who's the real enemy in the First World War? It wasn't the Kaiser, it was the Brits. And that's a characteristic insular, parochial, ochre way of looking at Australian military history. And that's one of the reasons why I'm a bit disillusioned with Australian military history. So lots of Australians now are kidded by those populist nationalists, those authors, who believe that the Brits or the English really didn't try on Gallipoli and didn't do much at all, and in other parts of the war really let the side down. Now that's just my assertion, but let me give you an example. You might recognise the gentleman with the hat on. That is, of course, General Sir John Monash. Now, Monash was the commander of the Australian the Australian Corps in 1918. And the popular media in Australia will have you believe that Monash was, see the middle one, the Forgotten Anzac. This is a man who not only commanded the Australian Corps in 1918, but he's on the $100 note. Now, you get a lot more $100 notes in Australia than you get £100 notes in Britain. Do you have £100 notes? I don't know. But anyway, you see a lot of them. A lot of people have got Monash in their pocket. There's a university named after Monash. There's a suburb in Canberra named after him. There's a freeway in Melbourne named after him. And there were about 6 documentaries last year which tried to tell us that Monash was, first of all, paradoxically, Monash was forgotten, but he also won the Great War. It is bizarre. We were told that Monash, who was, let me remind you, the most junior corps commander on the Western Front in 1918, we were told that he invented combined arms warfare, infantry tank aircraft cooperation. In fact, he invented the blitzkrieg tactics that Hitler used to conquer Western Europe and Poland in 1940. It was all down to Monash. He was very narrowly posthumously promoted to Field Marshal a couple of years ago. And it was only the Australian Army, God bless them, digging their heels in and saying, I'm sorry, but he can't have a Field Marshal commanding a corps. That doesn't work for us. If the Army had given in, we would have had Field Marshal Sir John Monash. It's absolutely ludicrous. And as you can see, some of those popular authors I mentioned, those lazy popular authors, there's 3 of them. Peter Fitzsimons, Ashley Keyser, who's a boxing journalist. Sorry, a bit snobby, wasn't it? And Roland Perry, who's a very nice man. But they can't resist telling you that Monash... Oh, is that... Yeah, that's right. Monash, the outsider who won a war. Brilliant title again. There's only 2 things wrong with it. One is Monash wasn't an outsider. He was a millionaire. He hobnobbed with the Prime Minister. And he didn't win the war. But apart from that, it's a brilliant title. And of course, Monash the Forgotten Anzac. Now, just a side issue, I appeared... Oh, and you can see that the sort of journalism that's being published. This is the Sydney Morning Herald, not a rag, but a proper newspaper. Did an Aussie General, John Monash, actually win the decisive battle of the Western Front? Not the British who've hogged all the glory. That's absolutely typical, characteristic of the sort of reporting that we've seen in Australia especially over the last 4 or 5 years, but really it's been going on for about 20 years. And just to digress, I was in Monash the Forgotten Anzac, that documentary, and it made me realise that it doesn't matter what you say, it's what the director and the producer want to say that counts. And you know, anything you said that was critical or qualifying gets left out. And it persuaded me that if you want to do TV documentaries, you really have to make your own. Not that I am. So, in all this, it's routine for Australians to claim that the Australian Corps punched above its weight. That's the usual claim, but was denied credit by a British conspiracy. For example, it is believed in Australia that the would-be Field Marshal Sir John Monash would have replaced Sir Douglas Haig as commander of the British Expeditionary Force, and it was only British nefarious conspiracies that stopped him. You know, it's just fantasy, bizarre. And people like me, the English-born Professor Stanley, get into trouble for daring to suggest otherwise. So even though you might say, and I'm not the only one to say it, there are lots of good military historians in Australia, and most of them say these things, that Monash was just one of a group of senior British officers, British Empire officers, who applied those hard-won lessons of the war, that combined arms operations had been devised by 1918 and were standard across the BEF. They were used by all of the BEF's corps and armies. And that the press did give credit to Australian formations, if less than Australians thought they deserved. And Monash was recognised at the time. He was knighted after the Battle of Amiens, for goodness sake. Now, this isn't just me versus these nationalist fantasists, because I think it's not just one-off, there's a trend. And let me give you another example of the trend. Sadly, not from the First World War, but from the Second World War. This dangerous and unfortunate connection between nationalism and Australian military history. Another sign of this is that over the past 20-odd years, the idea of the so-called battle for Australia has risen. And what this is that until about 1995, nobody in their right mind, nobody had actually studied the history, thought or believed that the Japanese actually planned to invade Australia. About 1995, the 50th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, the idea of a battle for Australia began to grow, and mostly promoted by, to put it crudely, the children of Second World War veterans. They were in their 40s and 50s, and they felt that their parents, especially their fathers, hadn't been recognised. And this idea grew, so that in 2008, coincidentally, weeks before the publication of my book, Invading Australia, the Australian government declared that the first Wednesday in September would be Battle for Australia Day. It's not a holiday, but it's a day on which Australians get together and give thanks that the Japanese weren't able to conquer Australia. Well, bit of a surprise, because the Japanese didn't actually plan to invade Australia. They thought about it, and they decided, quite rightly, that it was too hard and it wouldn't really help them much. I don't want to go into the strategy of 1942 very much, but the fact is that in early 1942, the Japanese, who, as you know, were winning everywhere in the Southwest Pacific, in Burma, and in the Pacific, they decided that they had a choice. They could either keep a garrison in China because there was a big war going on there. They could keep a big garrison in Manchuria because who knew what the Russians were going to do. They could keep going in Burma because it looked like it was succeeding. And they needed to do something about the Americans in the South, in the Western Pacific. So should they invade Australia? There were arguments. The Imperial General Staff went through the arguments. The Navy was quite keen, even though it couldn't raise the shipping, the merchant shipping to support it. The Army was absolutely opposed to it because they couldn't spare 10 divisions, and that's what they reckoned it would take. And so in about March 1942, the Japanese Imperial General Staff, whose minutes are very fully recorded, said, no, we're not going to do that. We'll send submarines to interdict, as they say, to sink shipping, merchant shipping, to supposedly stop communication between the United States and Australia, but we won't invade. And all of this history was perfectly accepted until about 1995. And in 1995, there's a bunch called the Battle for Australia Society, and that's a chunk of its website. And I'm going to read it out in a minute because you can't read it properly. The Battle for Australia Society started to lobby, and lobby governments hard, to prove that, in fact, the Japanese had planned to invade Australia, and it was only the Australian victories in Papua in 1942 that stopped them. Well, let's think of the chronology here. The Imperial General Staff decide not to invade Australia in March. The Japanese invade Papua in July 1942, and the Australians retake Kokoda in November 1942. So how does that work that the Australian victories in Papua in November stopped the Japanese doing something that they said they weren't going to do in March? I don't understand it. But you can see why people like me get into bad odour. And they get into bad odour. Some people will tell you that the Japanese did invade, but nobody noticed. There are websites dedicated to the fact that footprints were found on the beach in Rockhampton, or that there were lights seen in the hills near Broome, or that in Darwin somebody's uncle found a Japanese jungle camp in 1952, but he can't quite remember where it was now. And people saying, see, it's proof the Japanese invaded. I mean, there's just absolute bad craziness going on here. And the Battle for Australia Society is part of it. You can't make out the small print probably, but I'll read it to you. They say, in this quote from his latest essay, this is some years ago, published immediately prior to his sudden resignation from the Australian War Memorial, Dr. Peter Stanley reveals a monumental ignorance of Japanese and American war strategies in 1942. Dr. Stanley describes himself as a military social historian. So I think that's the worst crime. And I still do describe myself as a military social historian, but my departure from the War Memorial had nothing to do with the Battle for Australia. I'm not going to give him any satisfaction there. But it got to the point, actually, where I now carry around this. This is my declaratory certificate of citizenship. And it proves that I'm an Australian citizen. Because on Talkback Radio in Adelaide some years ago, a lady said, hey, he should be deported for what he says. So I thought, well, I'll show this, and I'll be able to prove that you can't deport me because I'm a citizen. And I should go home to England, and more of coming home to England in a little while. What I'm trying to suggest here is that military history in Australia is freighted with this burden of national identity. And it is a bit in New Zealand, although they haven't got Monash or the Battle for Australia, and probably in Canada as well. Although I do think Australia's tendency to parochialism is much more strident. Now, I know that Britain struggles to maintain perspective on its wars, Dunkirk spirit, the poppy disease, Britain facing Nazi Germany alone, forgetting the fact that there's an empire, or was, and military history gets skewed in all sorts of ways. But the thing is, we live in an age of nation states, and the historians of the Great War are trying to understand an empire, and our world is completely different to the world that they lived in. And that means that we as historians have to stretch ourselves to encompass that. Just before I leave the Australian example, on the train coming up today from London, it occurred to me that I should mention honest history, because you might think it's just me crying in the wilderness, but it isn't. Back in 2013, a bunch of us formed a group called Honest History. It arose from the fact that about 2008-9, a group in Canberra, again, the sons and daughters of Second World War veterans, had the brilliant idea to erect a memorial to the two world wars on the shores of Lake Burley-Griffin. If you haven't been to Canberra, and you must come, it's a lovely city, it's got a big lake in the middle of it, and on the shores of this lake they wanted to put these two enormous concrete monoliths to commemorate the First and Second World Wars. And a bunch of us got together and said, that's not a good idea. We've got this thing called the Australian War Memorial that does that job perfectly well. In fact, it does it brilliantly. I mean, me and the War Memorial don't get on anymore. But the fact is, it's one of the great memorials of the world. It's a research centre, it's a museum, and it commemorates the Australian service and sacrifice in war absolutely abundantly. So we don't need another one of those, thanks very much. And we ended up stopping this ridiculous notion. And then we sat around and thought, gee, we should keep doing this, because we were starting to see what was happening through the Anzac centenary. Notice in Australia it's called the Anzac centenary. Here it's called the Great War centenary, or the centenary of the First World War. But in Australia it's called the Anzac centenary. And we said it's leading to that sort of parochialism and that drum banging and that special pleading that you see all the time about the First World War. So we started this idea of honest history, looking for, supporting balanced and honest history, trying to persuade people that Australian history wasn't all about Anzacs, and that we needed to think about the way in which we were thinking about history. It just happens that the page I first found had your ex-Prime Minister David Cameron there with a group of school children, because there's a lot of that goes on as well, where children are conscripted into manifesting these patriotic ideas Anyway, so we started it, and the struggle goes on. That's an article from Paul Daly just last week, arguing that if we're going to talk about war, let's not coat it in sugar. Let's tell the truth. Honest History's just about wound up. We decided that we weren't going to get obsessed by it. We basically ran it through the Anzac centenary. We did good work. We got lots of people appreciating what we'd done. We didn't stop anything really, because the War Memorial, this is why I've fallen out with the War Memorial. The War Memorial is about to undergo an extension and an expansion to the tune of $498 million. That's $500 million devoted to basically beefing up its treatment of the conflicts in the last 30 years, which is completely disproportionate. But that's not what I'm here to tell you about now. But the fact is, we didn't win on that one. And we're not wrapping up because of that, because we wrapped up a few months ago. But the fact is that this juggernaut rolls on. And I mention all this by way of preamble, because it's on this relationship between national history and the various bits of the British Empire that I want to talk about now. Moving from the national to what you might call the international, the relationships. And that's actually one of the most promising developments in Great War Studies, because I'm sure that Wolverhampton's war studies people exemplify this trend, where it's no longer just enough. I mean, I know people might write theses about, the Warwickshire Pals and nothing else, but over the field of Great War Studies, people have started to take a broader view. They've started to notice that other people were having similar experiences or different experiences. And it's about those contrasts that I want to talk. Well, as you saw a few minutes ago, I can prove I'm an Australian by citizenship, because I arrived in Australia as a migrant 53 years ago. We migrated from Liverpool in 1966. My mum says we left because it rained too much in Liverpool. Surely that can't be true. Anyway, it's a decision we never had cause to regret. But as you've just seen, having dual nationality complicates not just your personal life, but your professional life as well. That's that English-born Professor Stanley again, you see. So I visit Britain quite a lot, about once a year, mostly to do research on these books that Gary's mentioned. And I'm now 2/3 of the way through a 6-month sabbatical here, having a wonderful time researching and writing that next book on the Santal Rebellion. Absolutely nothing to do with the Great War. And being in Britain for more than 3 weeks is a terrific boon for me. Even though I think I've arrived at a very turbulent and frankly distressing time in your nation's political history, but it's given me the time to luxuriate in being in Britain for longer than a short time. And so I've been reflecting on my complicated relationship with the land of my birth. But living even here temporarily has allowed me to see parts of Britain I haven't visited before. Wolverhampton isn't one of them. I was here last year. To try new experiences, to read The Guardian every day on paper, to listen to Radio 4 and watch British television. I've got to say, British television is not as good as it used to be. I think because it's the same quality spread over more channels, and its quality is a bit more diluted. Same in Australia. And I'm not going to say a word about Peaky Blinders because I know where I am. I'll take on the Battle for Australia Society or the Friends of Monash, but I'm not taking on Peaky Blinders, so I'm just not saying anything about that. But living in Britain comes with irritations as well. For one thing, I'm obliged to use those little brown coins. Do you know when Australia got rid of little brown coins? 1992. We haven't used them for 30 years. Now people keep giving me little brown coins. Your attitude to driving. Why can't I turn around in your driveway, especially when your roads are so bloody narrow? All sorts of stupid things about this. Every time I turn the TV on, somebody starts a sentence with, so, or they say, obviously, when it's not obvious at all. Obviously, they say. But the biggest irritation of all about being in Britain, actually, is when you talk about the rest of the world. Because when you talk about the rest of the world, you always say out there. Have you noticed that? It's true, believe me. If you describe a man who's retired to Spain, who I actually met, a bloke who retired to Spain last week. He drove us from Granada to Gibraltar. And he said he'd lived out there for many years. Out there, see? If you've got relatives in Zimbabwe, you'll say, oh yeah, we go out there to see them. And if you go to Florida for your holidays, you say, yes, we go out there every year. I've got to say why. But the fact is you say out there. And practically anywhere outside Britain is qualified by this proposition out there. You do that, don't you? You recognise that? Yeah, yes, thank you. So obviously, I'll tell you why. Because what you're doing is you're setting up or you're confirming an assumption that here, Britain, is the centre of things, and everywhere else, is out there, is away, is somewhere else. It's on the edge, it's on the periphery. And I've got to tell you, hardly anybody in the world does that anymore. It's only Britain who does it. Australians, we don't talk about coming home anymore. I mean, I could, because I am, but I don't, because we don't. We don't come home, we come to Britain. We don't think about the world being divided into places that are important and places that aren't, but I think Britain does. And historians, and especially historians who deal with the history of the British Empire, as all Great War historians have to, I don't think they should perpetuate that unhelpful and I think actually dangerous geographic hierarchy. Britain isn't the centre of Great War studies, although I suppose you could be forgiven that if you came from Wolverhampton. Now you might think this is a typical piece of Australia chip-on-the-shoulderism. I do suffer from Australia chip-on-the-shoulderism, although I just realised today I hadn't heard the convict joke for about 10 years. It's strange. I used to come here in the 1980s. People would make jokes about convicts all the time. It was really boring. But they haven't done that for a while, so I haven't got that chip on the shoulder. I am actually making a serious critique of a problem, an impediment in understanding the Great War, because we're all interested in understanding the Great War, and specifically this evening about the Great Britain and the Empire. So let me explain. That's the British Empire. It's more or less right. I left a few things off. Apologies about that. If you think I've missed anything important off, let me know. But you can see that that's more or less the British Empire. I've included South America, by the way, because although there were no British colonies in most of South America, there was massive British investment and even settlement. You know, the Welsh in Patagonia, the British in Argentina. And there were lots of South American Britons who came to fight in the Great War. But that's sort of more or less the empire. And I haven't been clever and made the names proportional to the population, because India would be huge. And Australia would be tiny. But I've just indicated roughly. It's a sort of a refresher. Now that's more or less a diagrammatic view of the British Empire. And that's the way people used to think about imperial relations. It used to mean the way individual dominions or colonies related to the imperial centre. It's sort of bipolar. It was all about Britain and somewhere else. And so as a whole, if you look into directories of theses, you find British economic relations with New Zealand, 1890 to 1930, with particular reference to the trade in frozen lamb. Britain and West Africa, groundnut industry. England, West Indian test matches as imperial diplomacy. I just made those up, but they make sense, don't they? That's the sort of theses people used to write about, home and away. And military historians actually don't seem to have done that much, because it's only recently that military historians have started to think about the empire even in bilateral terms. But it has started. So since, I don't know, I suppose the 1980s, military historians have started to study the relationships between military forces of the empire and how that can represent the empire in microcosm. This is a bit of an assumption, is that relations between military forces in the British Empire are worth looking at because they're a microcosm of the evolution of the ways in which those protagonists think about each other, think about the empire, and changed through war. The Great War is a really important forcing house for changes in imperial ideologies and identities. Without the Great War, Australia wouldn't have had that assertive nationalism. The war really accelerated, in all the dominions, it accelerated the ideas of national identity in all the dominions. Now the problem is, this is how the Great War usually sees, or has usually seen, the empire. The Great War revolves around Britain, and other places in the empire aren't very big. They're not very important. I've probably exaggerated this, but I'm arguing that Britons aren't as familiar with or used to looking at bits of the empire as I think they should have. Even when, as I say, millions have migrated to Canada and to New Zealand and to Australia, and even, how stupid were they, South Africa. And this idea of out there, I think this is where it comes from, is that it intensifies the British preparedness to overlook the Commonwealth and the Empire, even though the Queen very assiduously mentions the Commonwealth every Christmas Day. And this benign neglect of the Empire and the Commonwealth wasn't altogether, or not only, Britain's fault, because the great project of the 19th century was acquiring and populating and acquiring this empire, profiting from it, of course. But the great project of the 20th century went the other way, that in the 20th century, with the exception of Gibraltar and the Falklands, and I've been to both of those places in the past year, that senses of national identity were created and they came to dominate. And they created a separation from Britain. And that's why Australians are so strident about emphasising the Australian Imperial Force's role in the First World War and how much it contributed and what the war cost Australia and what the war did for Australia and how Australians have been neglected. It's all about nationalism. And the Great War is the single, I'll say this, it's the single most important development in fostering this increasing sense of national identity and difference from the mother country, especially among those so-called white dominions. And that's why Australians especially are so down on the British Empire. Not sure what this next one is. Oh yes, that's right. And I'm not trying to be simplistic here, but I also recognise that, of course, if you look from Australia, it looks just like England. But if you're in Britain, and if you know anything about Britain, of course it means more than just England. You have to recognise that Britain encompasses a whole range of other identities. And that's what makes Great War studies, I think, so interesting. That it's not just a matter of Australians bumping into British troops. It's a matter of Australians relating to troops who might come from all of those places, all of which would be somewhat different in the way they think, their attitudes, their feelings, their identities, their loyalties, their language. They're all different. It's a really complicated and really interesting problem, and it's something which a lot of Australians certainly don't appreciate this, just as you may not appreciate the difference between Victorians and Tasmanians, say. But the more you look at these things, the more interesting and complex they look. So I'm trying not to make glib generalisations about Britain, because you quite rightly would say, which bit of Britain? And if you disagree, by the way, make a note, because we've got time for questions later. Now, this is, I think, the way things should go, that there are clearly dominions of the empire became independent nations, and of course they created and produced their own historians. So Australians historians can look at Australia's relations with other parts of the empire, and every bit of the empire can look at every other part of the empire's relations. That's actually not a realistic diagram, is it? Because if the, I don't know, East Africa probably did have a relationship with India, but East Africa doesn't have much of a relationship with Australia or New Zealand, or West Africa. It has a relationship with Britain, but it has no relationship with Newfoundland. So that's a matrix of possibilities, but in reality, the choices are a lot less. But they're not much less, because I'm going to show you something in a minute that suggests that multilateral studies of the British Empire in the First World War could be a really productive field of study. I mean, it already is, but I'm going to suggest something in a minute that might really excite you. Gee, that was a promise, wasn't it? Okay, yeah, so, yeah, I mean, if you look at the Straits settlement or Fiji, for example, they had next to no, they were a resource for the Great War, but they didn't have experience of the Great War, and they certainly didn't have a relationship with other parts of the world. I mean, the Hong Kong and Singapore artillery went to Aden, which isn't on that map, but you know, it's not very significant. So I'm not suggesting that there are lots of ways of making these pairings just for the sake of them. Although you never know. I mean, who has looked at the Hong Kong and Singapore artillery experience of the Great War? You have. There you go. You can tell us all about that later. And one reason I'm a bit sceptical is that what are the sources? I mean, did members of the Hong Kong and Singapore artillery write much about their experience of Aden?
Pension records.
Pension records. There you go. Well, I hadn't thought of those. That's great. Thank you. Oh, I want to hear more about that, David. And the thing is that might be an abstract matrix, but I think there is something in this, and I'm going to show you what it is in a second. How can you possibly find the real stuff in that? And I'm going to offer you this. Oh, no, that's the more realistic view, that there are only some of those pairings that actually are productive. But I think there's more than just a dozen. This is Stanley's patent, Great War Imperial Military History Thesis Topic Finder. What you do is you find a word from the first column, you connect it with a noun from the second column, and one from the third column, one from the fourth, and there's a subtitle, all right? And so, for example, you can pick your own. London War Brides and West African Churchmen. an economic history. Yeah, I don't know if that's going to fly. But the thing is, you can see that there's ideas there that might work, that nobody's ever thought of. The one that attracted me was Tasmanian volunteers and British prostitutes. Because I reckon there's got to be sources in Hobart that help you work that out. Not just pension records, but VD records too. East African carriers and what? Natal doctors. Now that's possible, isn't it? Maybe there are records in South Africa kept by doctors who were sent off to Kenya. That's possible. Take just Highland farmers and Shanghai children. No, that's not going to work either. But the point is that you can see the possibilities. And in fact, I'm not very good with figures, but I did the sums on the number of possibilities. And in fact, if you use just this generator, you get 2,476,099 theoretically possible thesis topics. And if you think, did anybody's own thesis appear on this list? So if it does, you should see your supervisor immediately. But I think that, I mean, jokes aside, what I'm suggesting is that the empire is a vast and complex organism, and that its constituent parts related to each other in ways that we probably don't realize or haven't sufficiently considered. West African chieftains and what do we say? Scottish churchmen. That could work because, missionary. Who's used missionary sources to look at Great War history? Not very many people. And then, of course, you complicate it with the subtitle, because you could do all of those potential pairings with all of those potential approaches, and you'd get a different thesis every time. Not necessarily one that would pass, but you might get something out of it. For example, and others. There actually are real topics there. Australian sailors and Scottish noblemen. Did I put that in? Anyway, Australian sailors were based at Rosyth in Scotland, and Lord Linlithgow, who owned Hopeton House, you can go and visit it, he had been Governor-General of Australia. And so that Lord Linlithgow's family papers actually give you insights into the experience of Australian sailors in Scotland for the duration that HMAS Australia was part of the North Sea, the Grand Fleet. So there actually are topics that are floating around, waiting to be done. And using my patent Great War Imperial Military History Thesis Topic Finder, you might find some. Not such a silly idea after all, perhaps. Anyway, we've had our fun. Let me move on to 3 examples of where this looking at the relationship within the empire actually makes sense. Oh, God. Okay, Quinn's Post. Back to Quinn's Post. I said the New Zealanders fortified it. It was fortified by that man in the middle, a guy called William Malone, British-born New Zealander, killed in August on Gallipoli, and a national hero in New Zealand, quite rightly. Under this legendary figure, Quinn's was turned into a fortress. And as I said before, through looking at New Zealand and Australian stories about Quinn, New Zealand memories about Quinn, I understood the place better. And I started to understand that it wasn't always about Australia, that in fact the New Zealand story on Quinn's is really important. And it's important to New Zealanders in ways I hadn't appreciated. That's why the book's called Quinn's Post Anzac Gallipoli. Not just because it's about the place, because it's an Anzac story. And I mentioned that the growth of national identity in those dominions inclines people to only tell the story of their own nation. So Australians tend to only tell Australian stories. And that's not the way the war was experienced. Let me give you another example. As Gary mentioned, I did a book on Anzacs and Indians on Gallipoli. I'd always been interested in Anzacs, in Indians on Gallipoli, because I was interested in the Indian Army. The very first article I published after I started at the War Memorial in 1980 was about the mountain gunners on Gallipoli, because the War Memorial had the records of a British officer of one of the 2 Indian mountain batteries on Gallipoli. When I started at UNSW in 2013, I was able to do anything I liked. And the thing I liked was to write a book about, as Gary said, a subject that hardly anything at all had been published on. Now, to do this book, which Duncan very kindly published, involved, you had to research in Britain, in India, in New Zealand, in Nepal, and of course you had to do the field work in Turkey. Oh, and in Australia. And that makes the point about how hard it is to do this kind of comparative history. It's really important, but it's also difficult and expensive, but it's worthwhile. One of the things that came out of this book was that when I started this research in 2000, started seriously in 2013, the world thought that there were 6,000 Indians who'd served on Gallipoli. About half of them were Gurkhas. And the fact is that when you did the work in the National Archives of India, you discovered that there are 16,000. That's 10,000 more Indians that served on Gallipoli, and literally nobody knew about them. So writing the first book about Indians on Gallipoli, I think, made a little contribution to understanding not just the experience of Indians on Gallipoli, but the empire and the relationships. Because how do you write a book about these men? Of the 16,000 of them, 15,900 were illiterate. They didn't write diaries and letters and that sort of stuff. There are no censorship reports from Gallipoli as there are from the other side of the world. So where do you find the sources? Well, you find them in Australia and New Zealand, because the Australians and New Zealanders wrote about the Indians. Now, the obvious point to make, of course, and you'd be right to think, that's a problem, because if the only sources come from Australians and New Zealanders and Britons, then they're the voices that get represented. And where are the Indians in this? And I say, what choice do we have? Because there are literally there is one interrogation report from a Gurkha, which was conducted in Gurkhali, translated into Turkish, and then translated 80 years later into English. And that's the only first-hand testimony that we've got from the 8,000 Gurkhas who served on Gallipoli. It's not easy, but it needs to be done, and it can be done. And finally, as Gary mentioned, terriers and Indians. I did this book because in 2012 I happened to be in the Cantonment Cemetery in Firozpur in the Punjab, and I looked around. I was looking for graves from the 1840s, but I looked around and all I could see was the graves of Hampshire cyclists and Kent artillerymen. And I realised that these were all British territorials. Well, what are British territorials doing in a cemetery in Firozpur, I said. And I looked it up, and of course, the long, long trail talks about these guys. You can find out, facts about which units went to India, but there was no single book. There was no book at all, in fact, about the experience of the 50,000 British territorials who served in India. So I went off and wrote Terriers in India. And in the course of that, one of the sections of it, I looked at terriers' relationships with regulars, because they replaced the regulars in India, but there were still regulars there to instruct them on how to live in India and deal with the natives. And of course, the other regulars in India were the Indian Army. So there's a terrier who addresses a Subedar Major as boy, which is not the right thing to do in India. And he learned that that wasn't the right thing. And this rhyme, written by a private of the 2nd 4th Hants, 1915, indicates the kind of regard that these British citizen soldiers had for Indian regulars. And you can see, it's basically a poem about how rascally the cantonment wallahs are, that they'll rob them and overcharge them. But he says, but in our fights, I can't read it there, but in our fighting forces there are Indians, as good as any men you'll find where'er you chance to go. This rhyme does not apply to them, they're soldier men, you see. They are soldiers of the empire, just the same as you and me. And that opens up the whole field of relations of these soldiers of the empire, the way in which they responded and reacted to each other. And again, there's next to no Indian testimony about territorials, but there's lots of territorial testimony about Indians, because territorials, like Australians and New Zealanders, were addicted to writing diaries and letters, and especially to taking photographs. Unlike regulars, who didn't write anything much and certainly didn't take photos, the terriers there's literally thousands of photographs in their albums, all through the record offices and the regimental museums across, it was Wessex and home counties. They were only from southern England, except for the Shropshire Light Infantry, the Breconshire Battalion, and a couple of battalions of the Border Regiment. For the rest of them, they were all from Somerset and Hampshire and Dorset and Kent and so on. That top right image is Somerset territorials, a couple of sergeants who were looking at a fakir lying literally on a bed of nails. You think it was just in cartoons, but it wasn't. They're encountering India. And that's an indication, I think, of just how the Great War opened men's eyes, mostly men, opened people's eyes to the existence of other parts of the empire, to other cultures, and really gave us, I think, a way forward. Last slide. I'm not the first person to think about this. There are lots of good books that have already come out looking at the way in which people from one bit of the empire related to others. Nearly 50 years ago now, Suzanne Brugger did a terrific book on Australians and Egypt. Eric Andrews did a great book called The Anzac Illusion, but it was about the relationship between Britain and Australia through the Great War. Jeff Kildare did a great book on Anzacs and Ireland, although he's actually not about Anzacs, it's about Australians and Ireland. He appropriates Anzac. I haven't read this book, Geoffrey Jackson on the British and Canadians on the Western Front. By the way, apologies that I have only said the word Western Front, the term Western Front now, in the very last minute of the lecture. And this year, a book came out by Steve Marty, an amazing achievement, young Canadian PhD, writing about the voluntary war effort in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. And you can imagine the research that it entailed. So it is possible, and I think we should do it. And I've far exceeded my time, I'm afraid. But thank you for listening, and I'm really keen to have questions, and especially if you disagree. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.